Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good day and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Tabak. I will moderate our debate on the impact of this year's election. I have with me Chris Dahle. Chris, do you want to say a few words to introduce yourself?
Good morning. I am the president of the Lynn County chapter of the United Nations Association. We have monthly meetings here in Cedar Rapids from September through May, and invite speakers to come and discuss issues that are important internationally and to the United Nations.
And you told me you have an interesting personal background as well, right? Your origins in Africa, is that correct?
I was born and raised in South Africa, and I came here to go to college, but I've been here in Iowa for 40 years now, so I'm an Iowan.
All righty. And our second member of our panel is Lynda Waddington, who is a columnist here with the Gazette. Tell us a little bit more about your interests and role in the community here, Lynda.
Oh my gosh, I do quite a few different things within the community. I do a lot of public speaking, work with some at-risk youth, mentor some young writers. Really enjoying living here in Eastern Iowa. Tonight, I think we're going to talk about the election and its aftermath. Okay. So I think I'm here tonight both as the woman, which I've kind of been a lot lately in this election cycle, and also I've covered politics here in Iowa for over 2 decades. So a little bit of background to go with it.
And Hans Hassell is a colleague of mine at Cornell College, teaches in our Department of Politics. Tell us about some of your special interest in that area.
So my research and expertise is on political parties and campaigns and elections. So I teach the courses in American politics, campaigns and elections at Cornell. And I have published extensively on the influence of parties in primary elections specifically.
This is right up your alley.
This is what I do every day. This is what I enjoy.
So I'd like to begin by asking you each, were you surprised on Tuesday, November 8th, or the morning of Wednesday, November 9th? Was this a big surprise for you? So let's go around here.
I think to some extent, yes, right? Because you saw the polls that suggested very strongly that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And that's the biggest surprise of this entire election cycle, is that the polls were off by not large margins, but enough that it made a difference. They were systematically biased for a certain subset of states, and those subset of states happen to be critical, and that's very surprising, right? We've come to expect polling to be relatively good predictions, and it generally is. And there seemed to be something about either people not willing to express support for Donald Trump publicly, people saying that they were undecided, a variety of different aspects here that made this outcome perhaps a little bit more surprising. In other ways, I'm not surprised. There are models in political science that look at, predict presidential vote share on the basis of presidential popularity, on the basis of GDP growth in the past year, on the basis of how long a particular party has held that particular office. And that predicts the vote share of the both candidates almost perfectly, right? It's almost exactly on what we'd expect based on previous results. And so in some ways it's very surprising, but in other ways it's not particularly surprising at all, which is, I guess, is the story of this election, right? There are things that are different, and then there are things that are very much the same.
So politics interests me a lot, Lynda, but I had a big cold that day. So I went to bed not knowing what had happened, not turning on any TV, and then just waited till the next morning and turned on the computer when I got up. Did you stay up late to watch this?
Oh yeah. For anyone who listened, we were actually live at the Gazette talking as the returns came in, having different individuals call in to us and talk. I think with our group, that would have been myself and columnist Todd Dorman and political reporter James Lynch. I think when they called Florida for Trump, I think we knew at that point that this was not going to go how the polls had kind of told us it was going to happen. And I'm also very taken with this whole idea of the end results, to a certain extent, really match what we were seeing on social media. More than real life polls. You know, in the past we've talked about pollsters that only do landlines and don't do cell phones. But I wonder if that's becoming even more pronounced when you look at the advertising that went into social media, the decline of advertising in traditional venues. So I think we had a much different type of election, and I don't think it's going to be the last one in that respect.
Yeah, pollsters are continually trying to update how they weight these things, right? Because part of this is that response rates to polls on the phone have declined drastically, right? In the 1970s and 80s, it was a 30 or 40% response rate. I think Pew recently showed that it was under 10%, about 8% of 8% response rate. And so, in order to figure out, right, to get an accurate representation of what they think is going to happen, pollsters have to weight these polls to try to balance out, get a representative sample of the United States and who they think is actually going to show up to vote. And so part of this is it's becoming a trickier process as response rates have declined over time. And so I think that the polling industry is really struggling with this and trying to say, okay, we didn't get the result that we thought. How do we go forward and figure this out better?
Chris, what was your experience that day, and what's your engagement with politics here?
I was very surprised, to put it mildly. I stayed up until about 11 o'clock and was not happy with what was happening at that point in time, and decided that I better go to bed.
Okay.
And woke up the next morning, and it was worse than I thought. I have been a volunteer in politics here in Lynn County, working with the Democratic Central Committee and also canvassing on doing door knocking and that sort of thing for several previous elections, although I didn't participate that way in this current election.
So I'd like to know where you think the ideology played a role or didn't play a role in this campaign. I read one commentator who said this election was not so much about left versus right as it was about inside versus outside. And of course, on the Republican side, we had a candidate who didn't seem well connected or well grounded with the ideology that's motivated that party for many years. What do you think of this? Was this along a different dimension than we've seen before? And
well, you know, this was an election for change. I don't think there's any doubt that people went to the polls this year wanting something maybe a little bit different.
So what does that mean?
Wanting some change in their life.
Yeah.
I'll give you a personal example. My brother is a machinist. He works for a very large oil corporation, and he voted for Donald Trump. And he did so because he is one of those people who feels a little shaky economically. Yep. He doesn't feel like his kids are going to have the same opportunity to go into a corporation. I see Hans laughing at me, so we'll see what Hans has to say. But, you know, he is a little worried about those things. And on top of that, he absolutely just cannot stand Hillary Clinton. So, you know, he kind of had both avenues of this election coming at him. But definitely, he wanted to change. I don't know. We've had discussions, he and I, back and forth on whether or not he's actually going to get what he wants based on his vote. But, you know, he was willing to take that chance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a sense of change. I'm just not sure that it permeates much beyond the presidential level. If you look at Congress and the Senate, 97% of incumbents won re-election, which is even higher than it was in previous election cycles. And so I think that we've got this story that's driven by the Donald Trump narrative, but I'm not sure that that's really what's going on here. I think that I don't view it necessarily as a change narrative. I view it as a sense of feeling left out and feeling as though that the current administration is not addressing the needs of those individuals, and they're saying this is a problem. And so what you've got is not necessarily a change in the sense of I want a change in Washington. I just don't want the current Democratic administration in there, as opposed to I don't like politicians. I think that the Donald Trump is the exception rather than the rule in this election cycle, in my opinion.
I'm not convinced. When you look at Iowa, especially in the Senate, you had Tom Courtney, who had the Senate seat down in Burlington. I think James Lynch said he wasn't aware there were Republicans in Burlington, and Tom Courtney was ousted from his seat. You look here in town, we have a House seat by Todd Taylor, who's a very big union labor guy, a very friendly House district for him. And he had a Republican on the ballot with him, also a Libertarian, but the Republican just neglected to pull his name. He didn't actually run a campaign, and that Republican got as many votes as the person from, I think, 4 years ago who actually ran a campaign. So, I do see, I understand what you're saying nationwide, but I think here in Iowa, I think there's a lot of correlation to people, like you say, feeling left out, like my brother. Just can't stomach Hillary Clinton is another thing I heard a lot around Iowa, and looking for change.
There was a letter in the Wall Street Journal, Chris, that just said, flyover country to the coasts. Can you hear this? And that was the whole letter. Does this resonate with you at all?
Well, I think there has been a feeling of being left out and as being flyover country. But I think that the people, if they really want to change, they're really not going to get much in the way of change, because everything that Trump has done in terms of appointing people to his cabinet so far are old school. And I don't see much change coming.
And within the Democratic Party, we had an unusual campaign this year too with Bernie Sanders. So this is an unconventional candidate in some ways. What do you think of that? Is this making you, are we starting to think that Republicans are something different than what we thought Republicans were, and maybe Democrats are different than what we thought Democrats were? How did you look at the Bernie Sanders campaign?
Well, I sympathized with Bernie Sanders' positions on most things, but I didn't think that he was very electable myself. Apparently other people thought that he was more electable, and there have been some people writing since the election saying that maybe he would have done better against Donald Trump than Hillary Clinton actually did. I don't know if there's any truth in that, though.
Okay, I'm going to provoke you with another comment that I encountered in my reading. One of these commenters quoted Lord Acton, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. And said, we usually think of that as a reference to the person who holds high office. But that's also telling us something about the people who follow the person who holds high office. They make a lot of excuses for that, for their leader. And what we saw this year is Republicans voting for Donald Trump and excusing some aspects of his personal conduct, and people voting for Hillary Clinton and excusing some aspects of her personal conduct, and maybe some people voting because they didn't really favor the candidate, but they saw themselves as voting for the lesser of two evils in some ways. Did that make this campaign different than other campaigns for you? You see that?
Well, these are definitely two of the least liked candidates in our nation's history. I saw a poll where I think Trump was 39% favorable and Hillary Clinton was just right above him at 42. So if you wanted to be able to go to the polls and vote for someone who maybe you would like to go on a vacation with or invite over to your house for dinner, that person might not have been on the ballot this time at the presidential level. But I think most people aren't going there to necessarily vote for someone they like. I think they're going there to vote for someone who's going to do things that will benefit their family. At least that's what I hope, and I'm a little idealistic when it comes to voters. And I think the real tragedy of this election is that we never really got into that. I think Clinton tried here and there, but from the conventions on, There were a few little small blips about family leave policy and some other things that happened, but you really didn't have this big rollout of white papers and this big rollout of ideas where you could judge ideas. It was a personality politics from the conventions on.
Liam, what you just described, this idea of excusing your own candidates'
Right.
flaws and focusing on their highlights is what in political science we call motivated reasoning. It's this idea that when you get new information, you're not evaluating that information unbiasedly, right? You're
Right.
taking this information and you're saying, does it match with the information that I currently have? If it doesn't match, then I need to discount it. There's probably some reason that it's wrong or something along those lines, right? That's called motivating reasoning. And people, everybody, you, I, right, everybody here does that continually. That's part of the way that our brains are wired. And so we have this tendency to discount information that does not align with our particular views. And so partisan politics is full of this, right? We get new information and we say, okay, where is it coming from? Is it coming from somebody that I trust? Do I need to screen it out because it's not a source that I can trust or I believe in, or has given me good information in the past, or is aligned with my particular goals? And so we first off, we screen out this information. And second, if we do get this information, we're inclined to discount it if it doesn't actually align with our own preferences and our own prior beliefs that we hold.
So are there big issues that you think were left out of the discussion, Chris, as we talked about Clinton Foundation and emails and Donald Trump's treatment of women and so on and so on? Are there big issues that you would have liked to have seen addressed and that you think should be addressed now?
Well, one of the big issues that was not very well covered was a foreign policy.
Right.
They talked a lot about ISIS and Syria and things like that, but there was no real discussion of what the candidates plan to do in the future in terms of foreign policy. And that's a little bit troubling to me. The rest of the world is really worried about what the United States is going to do with Donald Trump. And Angela Merkel came out and said that she hopes that he will follow the rule of law and respect human rights. Mm-hmm. And that says a lot about what the Germans think about the president-elect at this point, I think.
Anybody else want to add to that about concerns from elsewhere about our...
Well, one of the things that I think is always interesting when we talk about the basis on which we elect people to office, and I think you're exactly right that most of the time most people don't investigate the issues with great depth, right? I think that this is kind of a very good example of that, where most people haven't really studied in detail to realize that there's not a lot of depth to Donald Trump's policy positions, right? I think at one point early on in the campaign he said, right, the only people that care about that are the media, right, or the journalists who want to read this. Everybody else, right, most people don't really care what my policy positions are. And I think that's generally the case. And so what we have to say is, can people pick up information through other cues and shortcuts that enables them to say, okay, maybe I don't know exactly what his policy positions are, but based on this information of who he associates himself with, what he says, how he comports himself, that gives me enough information to say, okay, I can identify generally what his positions will be. And then this other thing is that I think that we often think that we're electing a president or a public official to deal with the problems that we're dealing with now,
Right.
when in reality we're electing them to deal with the problems that are coming in 3 years. And we may not necessarily know what those problems are. And so I think that saying we need to do just the issues, I think leaves out some of the concepts of how well do we trust this person to behave themselves, and how would they get new information, how would they address new crises, and deal with situations that we have no idea what those ideas, what that's going to be. And so we have to be able to say it's not just about the issues, it's also about how do we trust these individuals to deal with situations that we can't vote on.
And I'm having this flashback listening to you to the day after the election when I'm watching CNN and the folks on CNN are trying to decide what it is that Donald Trump is going to do, for his first 100 days or 3 months in office. And nobody really has a clue. I mean, we know he's going to build a big, beautiful wall, supposedly to be followed by big, beautiful Mexican ladders. We know that he wanted to bring jobs. Believe me, he was going to do it. But we had no substance. And it was kind of like the day after this where everyone was just going, oh, whoa. What's going to happen now? And he was going to repeal Obamacare. And we had folks here in Iowa on election night saying, number one thing, when we get back to Congress, we're going to appeal Obamacare. Well, now we understand that's probably not going to happen, that we're going to be doing some tweaks and do some changes and keep some of the things that are very popular about it and maybe try to keep costs down in other ways. But the point being that, when you have this election that's completely built on personality, that's all you have when the election is over, is this personality, and where do you go from there? So, sadly, I think Donald Trump, to a certain extent, is right that most Americans don't dig into it except for those issues maybe that are very important to them. I don't know. Do you agree, Chris?
What's really troubling to me is the way that Donald Trump excluded some of the media from his rallies and is threatening to exclude the media even from the administration. So, and then with social media and Twitter and Facebook and things that also provide news that is not necessarily truthful, we have a real crisis in the future, I think, of freedom of the press, which is extremely important for any democracy.
So the other candidate went a long time without a press conference. He's arguing for a change in the law that would permit the suppression of the Citizens United, right? Can I distribute a book or a video that criticizes a candidate during the election period? So people on the other side are making this argument too, Chris. Yeah? No? Anybody want to chime in there? You want to fight me there, Lynda? Go ahead.
Well, I think it's different because I think we have this expectation of the media that it's going to provide some unbiased.
Right.
We have this tradition. The media doesn't originate in an unbiased media, right? If you go back to the penny press, that's an organization that shills a particular candidate or a particular party. But ever since that, we've had a news source that is trying to appeal to as broad a readership as they possibly can to be profitable.
Right.
But that's declined, and this comes this question of can we want this because we think of it as a good source for democracy, right? This idea of freedom of information to allow people to evaluate and then have their voices heard and to be able to make a meaningful choice. But without that, we have to say, well, can we survive in a world where we may not necessarily have unbiased sources, where we have to get our media from a certain skew, and if we know that press has a certain skew, are we able to figure that out and say, okay, here's what they're saying, knowing their biases that they have, what do I actually believe is actually truthful?
Some Republicans said to themselves, we don't like Donald Trump's policies, we don't like Donald Trump's character, but we think he's a better alternative than Hillary Clinton, and in part because we think that we can check the excesses of Donald Trump, but we won't be able to check the excesses of Hillary Clinton, who will have the support of the media, who will have the support of the academic community, who will have the support of the arts and entertainment industry. But Donald Trump, half the Republican Party will be lined up against him, the whole Democratic Party, the whole federal bureaucracy. His excesses will be held in check. Does that argument persuade anybody on this panel?
I think a lot of hopes are resting on that argument right now. There are certain things that he is going to be able to do because these are things that presidents have been able to do in the past. Executive orders being a big one. We have seen that kind of grow and grow and grow with each presidency that comes along. And, it will be good if Congress kind of puts a check on that and kind of pulls that and reins that in. The downfall of that, or the downside of that, is that with the Congress deadlocked and nothing coming out of it, the only thing that's really moved the conversation forward has been these executive orders. So hopefully, if we have everyone from one party down there in the majority, although they still can't beat a filibuster in the Senate, which will be a big hurdle, hopefully we will finally start to see some progress. It may not be what everybody wants, especially the folks that voted for Hillary Clinton, but hopefully at least we're going to see some movement and some gears turning in Washington, D.C. I want to go back to the media for just a moment, because I think that's a really big topic. As someone who has kind of written about this election, who's been out at events and done all these things, the past 2 years, going through the Iowa caucus, going through this presidential election, has been the most vile that I have ever experienced in all my years as a journalist. And I think we have two different rules. You have your new media that's basically internet-based, that can say what they want to a certain extent, do what they want, show what they want. And you have your traditional media that are still trying to play nice. One example, we get our images of the Gazette through Reuters. And if you go in there, you can go to the Trump rallies, and the photographers are taking pictures of the Trump supporters turning around and making nasty gestures. There's video of them saying nasty things. That doesn't end up in your Sunday paper, but that definitely can end up on a website. So there's also a different playing field that we're going to have to learn to balance going forward.
So we're coming towards the end of our discussion, and I want to give you each the opportunity maybe to make some predictions of where you think that things are likely to go in the next few months. Who would like to chime in there?
That's a dangerous thing, making predictions.
There's no consequences if you're wrong.
I didn't bring my ball.
I think there'll be a short honeymoon for Donald Trump, but I think that they'll try to push legislation through as quickly as possible and get the Supreme Court filled as quickly as possible. But I see a lot of conflict between the Democrats and the Republicans, especially in the Senate, and things will deadlock there, I think.
My prediction is a little bit further out. This coalition that elected Trump is an absolutely unsustainable coalition. I don't think you'll ever see a president elected with this subset and demographics in the future.
You're talking about the votes pulled from the Democratic Party? Is that?
I'm talking about the votes from labor, generally, that went over to there. I don't know if you'll ever have another Republican that comes out with that populist message, and also looking at the ethnic background, how the country's changing.
I'll disagree. I'll say that I think the president has an ability to remake the party, and I think that's perhaps the biggest concern, is that he'll change what Republicans believe because of motivated reasoning, and so he'll reform the Republican Party around a populist anti-trade message.
Is there going to be a reconciliation between the Donald Trump camp and the so-called elite establishment Republicans?
We'll see something. I don't know what it will be, but
all right. Well, we're seeing a lot of response on our campuses, and I'm sure in your letters to the editor as well. So thank you for being here, and it was a great discussion with you. I'm glad to meet some new people here in the community through this discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us today.